Hey everyone, I'm Mackenzie, the Spirits Department Manager at Everything Wine & More. And today, in conjunction with our upcoming whiskey sale, we're going to be talking a little bit about whiskey from Canada, the United States, and Scotland. We're going to be tasting some whiskey, dispelling some misconceptions, but this really is just an introductory whiskey tasting video. We could definitely do deep dives into Canadian whiskey, bourbon, Scotch, and there's the obvious omission of Irish whiskey, which we'll save for its entirely own video. And there are dozens of whiskey producing countries that are emerging right now, like India, Japan, Taiwan. So again, this will just be an introductory video. So we'll start on my right with some Canadian whiskey. Now, being from Alberta, you're probably all familiar with Alberta Premium. And the first talking point is going to be about Canadian whiskey and rye whiskey. So often people will come into the store and ask for a good rye, and often what they mean is a Canadian whiskey. So Alberta Premium is made entirely from 100% rye, whereas a lot of Canadian whiskeys are closer in mash bill to like a bourbon, which is predominantly corn. We'll talk a bit more about bourbon in a little bit. So rye is a bit of a misnomer. Most of the time when we say rye, we just mean Canadian whiskey, but there are examples of 100% rye whiskeys like Alberta Premium, Lot 40, and there's a lot of other craft distilleries doing 100% rye as well. Now in front of me, in addition to some different whiskeys, you're going to see a bunch of different glasses. And now there's tons of companies claiming that their glass produces the best whiskey drinking experience. And I think one thing to remind yourself about whiskey is drink what you like and drink it how you like. So I've got a rocks glass with a bit of Alberta Premium and just a little tasting glass with Alberta Premium. Exact same whiskey, exact same amount of whiskey. And if I smell the whiskey from the rocks glass, I don't get a whole lot, and I can really bury my nose in it. And I still get maybe a bit of vanilla and butterscotch, but I'm having a bit of difficulty getting any aroma off the rocks glass. Now, a little tasting glass like this, you definitely get a lot more of that aroma concentrated. So whether you're drinking out of something like a small, almost champagne flute, a little tulip glass, or the Glencairn glass, any glass that kind of tapers inwards is going to concentrate those aromas a bit more. And it's more for academic purposes. If I'm sitting down after a day of work and I just want a whiskey to relax, I might choose a rocks glass. I might even throw some ice in there or a bit of water. Again, it's my whiskey, my choice, and don't let anyone else tell you how to drink your whiskey. That is the most important thing about enjoying whiskey. Anyways, so a little bit about Alberta Premium. Like I said, 100% rye, and I'm gonna nose and taste it out of this one for academic purposes. And I get a lot of butterscotch, vanilla, maple, and a bit of oak. Now, to be a Canadian whiskey, you need to be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. You need to be aged for at least 3 years, and you need to be distilled from a blend of corn, barley, wheat, or rye. In some cases, it's one of those ingredients only, and often the ingredients are distilled separately. So in bourbon, you'll see all the grain in one mash tun, so almost like one porridge that consists of corn, barley, and wheat, or corn, barley, and rye, whereas Canadian whiskey, they're distilled separately and blended post-distillation, which is a really interesting fact. Okay, let's take a little sip of Alberta Premium. It's definitely a budget whiskey, but it's a good one. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. It definitely reflects the nose, and you get a lot of that butterscotch, vanilla, a little bit of oak. Comparing this to an American rye, I often get a bit more herbaceous spice characteristics from American rye. But this is a really nice warm-up whiskey to awaken the palate, right? Because the next whiskey we're going to look at is from America. We're going to dive into bourbon. And whereas Canadian whiskey, although there are a lot of fine rules and regulations, the greater scope of things is at least 3 years and distilled to no more than 190 proof, 40% ABV in the bottle. There's not as many regulations as when we dip into bourbon, where we could do an hour-long video just on the rules and regulations of bourbon. But let's just cover the main ones. So it's got to be produced in the USA. It's got to be made from a mix of grains containing at least 51% corn, and then the other grains are usually malted barley, rye, and wheat. And it has to be aged in a new charred American oak barrel, whereas Canadian whiskey can be aged in a used bourbon barrel or an ex-sherry cask or just about anything less than 700 liters and made from oak. Now, also for bourbon, you cannot be distilled more than 80% alcohol, and when it enters the barrel, it can't go in at any more than 62.5%. Bottled at no less than 40, and if it's straight bourbon whiskey, it's got to be aged for at least 2 years. Now, one of the most interesting points is it has to be aged in a brand new charred American oak barrel. That's a really unique law with bourbon, and let's do a little bit of show and tell. And here I have a portion of a barrel stave from Knob Creek, and we'll do a close-up on this for you, and you can really see the charring, and that's going to impart a huge amount of flavor to the whiskey. Now, you can see all my other glasses have a bit of whiskey in it, but one other thing I want to mention about whiskey is it's best to open your bottles of whiskey. And sometimes you're waiting for the right occasion to open a special bottle of whiskey. Here I have a Booker's, and Booker's is a single barrel, so it's going to vary. Every different batch is going to vary. This particular one is 7 years, 11 months. And I was thinking of saving this for a special occasion because it's quite an old Booker's. A lot of the ones you see on the shelf today are closer to 6.5 years old. This is definitely the oldest Booker's I've seen, but sometimes you have to make the whiskey the special occasion. So let's open this together. Let's crack the seal on that guy. I'm gonna get wax everywhere, but let's make the whiskey the special occasion. Now, I've never tasted this batch of Booker's, so this is a first for me. So let's just pour a little bit in there, because Booker's is cask strength, meaning it's not watered down after they dump it out of the cask, whereas Alberta Premium was 40%. At cask strength, this Booker's is clocking in at 63.65%. So it's a big bourbon. That's why I just want a little bit. I want to enjoy my whiskey responsibly. And let's give it a little swirl in the glass, in our Glencairn glass. And for a whiskey of such high proof, it's incredibly gentle on the nose. I can get my nose right in there, and it's not very obtruse. I'm getting a lot of licorice, some vanilla and baking spice, and a bit of like raspberry or some sort of berry there. Now, because bourbon has so many rules and regulations, you get a lot of the same characteristics from bourbon, from one bourbon to the other. One of the big contributing factors to the taste of bourbon is going to be how heavily charred are your bourbon barrels. So it goes on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being the lightest and 5 being the heaviest char. So if you're drinking a bourbon from a 5 char barrel, it's going to have a lot of that oak vanilla influence. Whereas if you're using a number 1 char, you're going to get a lot more of the mash bill as the influence. The mash bill meaning what grains you started your almost beer from. So this particular bourbon is going to be made from, it's made at the Jim Beam Distillery, corn, malted barley, and rye. And wheat is usually the more uncommon one. Maker's Mark, Weller, of course, all the Pappy, Van Winkles, they're all wheated bourbons. Whereas rye is going to lend a bit more of a spicy characteristic to it. Yeah, incredibly gentle for 63.65%. And let's take a little sip. Wow, a lot of like orange sponge toffee, definitely pretty oaky, a bit of like brandy cherry on there. There's a lot going on in this bourbon. Like this might be a whiskey that I sit down when I'm reading a book, or maybe playing a video game and I want something to think about, this is probably the one. Okay, so moving on to Scotland. Now there's a lot of different types of Scotch whiskey. We're going to focus mainly on single malts, and we'll talk a little bit about blends, but there's also blended malts, single grains. We could do a whole video on Scotch whiskey, but let's just focus on single malts. So first off, a single malt, it needs to be distilled and aged in Scotland. It's got to be made from 100% malted barley and from only one distillery. If I'm taking 100% malted barley from 2 different distilleries and blending them together, that's when I get a blended malt. It used to be called a vatted malt, but they've changed the language. It's now a blended malt. So it's got to be from one distillery. It's got to be aged in just oak casks for a minimum of 3 years and bottled at no less than 40%. And this particular whiskey is from Islay. It's Ardbeg, and one of the distinguishing factors of most whiskey from Islay is it's incredibly peaty. So peat and smoke are used kind of interchangeably. And what do I mean by peat? Well, it's this guy here. It's basically a lump of dirt for all intents and purposes, that when they're malting the barley, meaning they're soaking it in water, letting it germinate, converting those starches to sugars, once it starts to germinate, they want to stop that germination process, so they want to dry it. So you have 2 options for drying the malted barley, either just warm air or peat. And if you just stick your nose in there and smell it, it doesn't have a whole lot of smell to it. It just kind of smells like dirt, earth. It's not very fragrant, but when I start burning this, it's going to smell like an incredibly intense campfire. And that's often the distinguishing characteristic of Islay whiskey. In fact, I could smell Ardbeg from the start of the video when we were down here at Alberta Premium. It's incredibly fragrant, and I'm going to enjoy this from my little Ardbeg glass I got at the distillery. In fact, this lump of peat I got when I was at Laphroaig. I was a bit worried coming through customs with something that looked like that, but no problem at all. Anyways, let's take a little nose of this single malt whiskey from Islay. And this particular one, the Ardbeg & is aged in a combination of different casks. So brand new American oak, just like you'd see in bourbon, XPX casks, and then ex-bourbon casks. So immediately you're hit with that lovely peat aroma, and I say lovely, but it might be repulsive to some of you. Peat is a very polarizing aroma and flavor. I initially get the peat, a lot of malted barley. This is like an exemplary whiskey when it comes to showing off what malted barley tastes like. If you ever go to a distillery and grab some from the malting floor and eat it, they don't have any problems, pre-COVID at least. It's very cereally and grainy, and this really shows that characteristic off. And I also get a bit of like sultana, raisins, and that's probably coming from the PX, the ex-sherry casks. Now, let's take a little sip of Ardbeg. There's something slightly medicinal about it. And like I said, peated whiskey is very polarizing. The first time I had one, it was Laphroaig quarter cask. Thought it was absolutely repulsive. And it is something that you might grow into, or you might never like it, and that's completely fine. Most whiskeys from the mainland of Scotland, so in the Highlands, Speyside, are going to be unpeated. There are some whiskeys from those regions that are peated, but often they'll explicitly say it on the bottle. Campbelltown is kind of a mixed bag of peated and unpeated. Lowlands are usually unpeated. Now, again, we could do a whole video about the regions of Scotland, but a couple easy tips are where there's smoke, there's Islay. So let's take one last little sip of this Ardbeg. I look forward to seeing you in store. Check out the description for the details on the whiskey sale coming up. And I look forward to doing more of these videos. We'll do some in-depth Canadian whiskey, in-depth American whiskey, in-depth Scotch, of course, the omitted Irish whiskey. We'll do a tasting of Irish whiskey. And remember, always enjoy your whiskey responsibly. Have a nice night. Slàinte.